Thank you, Gerald, and thank you to Alvin and Gunter and Missy for your stalwart efforts in bringing us together this July. So the big question that I'm going to try to work toward answering is what is actually working and what are we doing right? I think maybe we'll end with more questions than answers, but at least we'll get somewhere. So let me start by defining what we mean by a policy prescription. So for the purpose of this paper, a policy is defined by a course of action, a plan, a rule, or a set of principles really to guide decisions. And a prescription is a recommendation that is authoritatively put forward. And working for a government-focused Jewish advocacy organization, American Jewish Committee, AJC, putting forth policy prescriptions is a top priority. And my hope for this conference, and Alvin and I have actually spoken about this before, is that the knowledge, the research, and the wisdom shared by all of us will actually translate into the field, into those who are practitioners, into creating sound policies, and really help guide our political and civic leaders. And so I actually really just want to thank all of the scholars and my fellow practitioners for the wisdom that you've shared thus far, and I look forward to the session this afternoon. So let me set the stage for this paper. Those of us participating in this conference are very aware that when we speak about anti-Semitism, we speak about historical, cultural, and economic contexts. And we know that anti-Semitism stems from longstanding economic tensions. It can be related to real or perceived power and wealth imbalances. We know that anti-Semitism is expressed through social snobbery, cultural biases, communal pride. We're aware that these beliefs, they've been called almost loose electrons conveyed by particular communities and players. And we know on this conference that when we organize by sources, we often stabilize something that is actually more fluid, because anti-Semitism does stem from within a deeper social conscience, something we actually have talked about as casual anti-Semitism. David Nuremberg has referred to this as the anti-Semitism as part of the grammar of the West. And we know it's irreducible to purely political categories and why it does have to be expanded beyond the far right, far left dichotomy. We've talked about all of this during our conference. And yet, what do we do with that knowledge when we know that nearly half of US adults, 46%, are actually not familiar with the term anti-Semitism? So AJC conducted a study of the state of anti-Semitism in America a report last October. And we found that 21%, so 1 in 5 of American respondents had never heard the word anti-Semitism before. And 25% had heard it, but could not say what it meant. And this number was even higher among young Americans, among Latinos, and among African Americans. And once the term was explained, because I understand that maybe they would have understood Jew hatred, maybe they would have understood another term, but even once the term anti-Semitism was explained, 53%, so more than half of US adults, of those who responded, believe that anti-Semitism has stayed the same or it's decreased in the last 5 years. And this is actually the opposite of what the data shows. We do know that there has been an increase in anti-Semitism in at least the past 5, if not 6 years. So because of this lack of awareness, practitioners have to synthesize a complex topic. We have to talk about the 3 main sources of anti-Semitism. We have to categorize those loose electrons, if you will, the far right, the far left, religious extremism, which includes Islamist extremists. And even though we have to categorize them, even though there's not a clear line of demarcation sometimes between the sources, and they do feed off each other. We also have to speak out unambiguously, even if it's not easy in the field. You have to speak with nuance, but you can't be as nuanced as you might want to be. And I know this from personal experience. So even with some of the attacks that happened in Brooklyn or in Jersey City or in Muncie, New York, or even the most recent attack in Boston, stabbing attack a few weeks ago, even though those perpetrators did not come from the far right white supremacist sources, which is often easier to call out in the United States, we still have to be unequivocal about where this anti-Semitism is coming from. We also have to promote national cohesion around the issue, that it's not a Jewish problem, it's a societal one, and it's not one for government or for the Jewish community to solve, but really for all Americans. And we have to ensure that our efforts are sustained. There aren't quick fixes. So making statements, even having conferences, even placing guards in front of synagogues while all very important, if they aren't sustained, if they don't lead to change, then they can just be band-aids over the larger problem when we really don't tackle the root causes. So our current policy prescriptions really do stem from what we have learned over the years, the things I just mentioned, what we have learned. These really inform our recommendations. So I want to focus on just three policy prescriptions. I think there's probably 10, 15, 20, but I'm going to focus on three, which, if enacted effectively, will work to lower levels of anti-Semitism in the United States. There are, again, many to choose from, but the first is going to be a prescription for the government, for local, state, and federal government. The second prescription I'll focus on is countering anti-Semitism online and on social media. And the third and last one is going to be about better data collection and its impact on the reporting and prosecution of anti-Semitic hate crimes. These policy prescriptions, and I'll clarify this, must be anti-Semitism specific. And in this conference, which it's great to go at the end because we've already talked about this, we talked about anti-Semitism as a hatred, and at AJC we also use the word Jew hatred. I will say that it's needed in many spaces, but we also know anti-Semitism is a conspiracy, and we do talk about how in our engagement with the government, in our prescriptions to government, to tech companies, to law enforcement and prosecutors, this distinction has to be understood. Anti-Semitism has to be understood in addition to maybe seeing it as a racism and treating Jews as inferior, that when Jews are assaulted or assailed for their supposed superiority, for their perceived control or power or wealth, that's also part of that problem. And if you don't have specific anti-Semitism prescriptions, you're not going to be effective in pushing back against this specific kind of hate. So the first policy prescription is asking government leaders to depoliticize, organize around, and prioritize the issue of anti-Semitism. And I'm going to start with the depoliticization. We have a serious issue with the politicization of anti-Semitism in our country, and we caught an in-depth glimpse of that yesterday in Basheva's presentation on House Resolution 183. Now I am going to share my screen. 1 second. Just to give a little. Okay, so until very recently, fighting anti-Semitism was one of the few issues upon which Democrats and Republicans could easily agree. This bipartisanship has been critical to American success in countering hatred against Jews around the world. But in the past, I would say 2 to 3 years, we've witnessed the politicization of anti-Semitism as a weapon in partisan politics. You can see some screen grabs here. And the danger here is having US government leaders not actually fighting anti-Semitism, but using it as a way to win votes. And we saw anti-Semitism charges in several elections in the last year, including the last Senate race in Georgia, when then incumbent Senator David Perdue ran a reportedly anti-Semitic ad during his campaign against Democrat John Ossoff. You can see a screen grab of this instance as well. The ad played on stereotypical anti-Jewish tropes. So it was John Ossoff and Chuck Schumer, both are Jewish. They were depicted as kind of these shadowy figures. And there was a caption that said, "Democrats are trying to buy Georgia." There was also a report that Ossoff's nose was widened and elongated, playing off traditional anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish features. Now, the Perdue campaign blamed an outside vendor for the error, said it was unintentional. The ad was eventually taken down, but not before it made several impressions on social media. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. We'll come back to there's a few more slides I'll be sharing. So secondly, when it comes to government organizing around combating anti-Semitism and making it a priority, this next recommendation is rooted in our experience in Europe. As many of you are aware, we first witnessed a new upsurge in global anti-Semitism beginning in the early 2000s, and especially in Western Europe. So currently, and I know we've had some Europeans on this call, so I'm thankful for your presence and your contribution here on this point. The Council of the European Union has actually mandated its member states to adopt and implement the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It's mandated its member states to appoint national coordinators to combat anti-Semitism, and third, to develop national action plans to prevent and fight all forms of anti-Semitism. So to date, the majority of EU member states have adopted the IRA definition. the majority of EU states, member states have. More than 10 have completed or are working on national action plans that are specific to just anti-Semitism. And they've also, many of them have also appointed national coordinators. In fact, Germany not only has a national commissioner or coordinator at the federal level, but each German state, so 16 in total, has a local commissioner solely tasked to counter anti-Semitism. In the United States, while we have a special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the US Department of State, and this is a position that we expect to be filled actually in the next few weeks based on some reports, this person's focus is external. We do not have a point person within the US government solely focused on combating anti-Semitism domestically. Now, while the idea of a domestic anti-Semitism czar, for lack of a better word, has pros and cons, and the cons have to do with our increasingly politicized environment, where there is a need, because I'm not actually advocating for the domestic anti-Semitism czar. I am advocating that we find a way to streamline the federal agencies' responses and responsibilities to combat anti-Semitism within the United States. So to that end, we recommend, one of our prescriptions is the appointment of an official at the federal level, maybe in the White House, that would lead the coordination efforts, that would lead the coordination efforts between Department of Justice, between Department of Homeland Security, between Department of Education. And I really appreciated Ken Marcus's words yesterday. And ideally, a national action plan for the United States would follow. Showing that combating anti-Semitism is a government priority beyond statements and resolutions is going to be through funding. And there is a clear and urgent need for additional resources for community protection. We know that 56% of Jewish institutions across the United States have increased their security in the last 2.5 years since Pittsburgh. And thankfully, and we need to continue to advocate for this, we saw an increase in fiscal year 2021 to the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. And this is a program that provides resources for physically securing houses of worship, which will go toward ideally halting further anti-Semitic incidents and vandalism of Jewish communal institutions. Prioritization of countering anti-Semitism also must happen at the state level, especially in education, which is mandated to the states, and to the local mayoral and city council levels. And a best practice we found here, and maybe this is Gerald, this might be a good news piece, is mobilizing large bodies. So whether, and AJC, you know, we're a leadership organization, so we like to work with leadership of like large bodies, whether it be the National Association of Attorneys General, National Association of State Secretaries, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is a big organization of mayors of over 1,400 mayors of cities of over 30,000 or more. And so we've actually had success in these spaces. And for instance, we have had 680 mayors from across all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, join a Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism initiative in the last few months. And they've joined this initiative, meaning that they are condemning anti-Semitism in all its forms, and specifically, and this is in the statement that they signed, including denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination and or the Jewish state's right to exist is part of that statement. And we've had 680 US mayors agree to this statement. And of course, there's follow-up that needs to happen as well. To conclude this last prescription, and the next two are going to go a little bit quicker, I want to say that political leadership really needs to lead on this issue right now. I actually think when we think about the kind of the crumbling of our political institutions, of bipartisanship, of what we're seeing in campaigns, it's not an anathema to actually rising levels of anti-Semitism, to be honest. And when we look at the history of anti-Semitism in the modern era, when we even think about the creation of the term itself by Marr in the 19th century, it was politics, right, which were organized against Jews, using Jews as a scapegoat for political gain and power. So strong political leadership, which does not use anti-Semitism as a political football, will contribute to countering rising levels. The second set of policy recommendations that I want to get to now, so this is number 2, focuses on the internet and social media. I see this every day. The future of combating anti-Semitism is combating the digitization of the problem. And I want to share a recent example. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. So let's just get to this next one. Some of you probably have seen this. So a month ago today, so June 28th, former Green Party presidential candidate and former US Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney tweeted a picture of the original World Trade Center Twin Towers burning with the text, "Zionists did it." The final piece of the puzzle. The trope resurrects the conspiracy theory that Jews orchestrated or knew ahead of time about the September 11th terrorist attacks. And when we saw this at AJC, we immediately reached out to our contacts at Twitter. After some time, we received this response, and this is a screen grab from my email. It says, upon review, the enforcement team decided that the tweet is not currently in violation of our rules. The team determined the nature of the tweet is strong political commentary. Now, according to its standards, Twitter does not allow users to engage in behavior. This is a quote from Twitter's policy page, engage in behavior that manipulates or disrupts people's experience on Twitter. And tweets also cannot deceptively share synthetic or manipulated media, which this is, that are likely to cause harm. And if it does, Twitter says that it will institute a label. Now, while this tweet may not constitute as hate speech under Twitter's policies, meaning that it would be taken down, a label that would say you are about to see conspiracy or disinformation would have been helpful. I think anything might have been better than Twitter officially saying that this was political commentary. Now, McKinney is a professor now in Bangladesh, and she's actually a long history of spouting anti-Israel rhetoric, accusing Jews of hindering her political aspirations. She has associated with prominent anti-Semites, and even just this past year, publicly questioned the number of Jewish Holocaust victims. So we explain this history to Twitter. We also explain the history of Jews, Israelis, and Zionists, which, being used as a proxy for Jew, has a long history of conspiracies dating back, to the Middle Ages up until today. And the 9/11 terrorist attack conspiracy theory is atrocious. And Twitter still said that the tweet did not violate its policies. And until this moment, and I did not check today, I think this tweet is still up. So Gerald, that's the bad news, but I'll stop sharing my screen and keep going on the prescription.
On a good note, though.
I will on the prescription itself. Okay, so the prescription itself. Because there are many instances like this, what we just saw, and there are double standards on all the major platforms, we really have a lot of work to do. And this is where I'm serious about the digitization of the problem being this next phase. And when we think about what's next after social media, something that my husband who's in the tech space actually refers to as the metaverse, which is a augmented reality meets our present day. That's a whole nother level we need to begin to focus on when it comes to combating anti-Semitism. But right now, in this moment, we know that the majority of anti-Semitic incidents to American Jews do happen online. We also know that almost half, 46% of those that are reported actually aren't addressed. So there's a huge gap in American Jews experiencing the anti-Semitism, reporting it, and it not being addressed. So we currently work with Twitter to some success, sometimes not to success, with Facebook and Instagram, Google/YouTube, TikTok, and Clubhouse, which is a newer audio-only platform. And these are the prescriptions that we are working with them on. The first is following a universal standard of what anti-Semitism is. So platforms should map the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism onto their policies. We've actually had some success here. There's no open, full adoption, but there's the integration of certain aspects of the IRA definition into the policies. We've actually seen this mostly on Facebook. Now, to the extent this is actually followed in moderation is another issue. We also explain that given the complexity of contemporary anti-Semitism, the companies must consider different language and cultural differences. So moderators who are not fluent in English have to be trained in their own language to understand policies related to anti-Semitism. After I finish speaking, I will drop into the chat a resource that we created called Translate Hate. It was really meant to understand anti-Semitism, especially in the digital space. And we're using that resource with those tech platforms that I just mentioned. The second policy prescription here is demanding transparency. Tech platforms should be transparent in the drafting of their policies, in their algorithms, and in their moderation systems, which they are not. And they need to abide by a set of core principles that will earn public trust. So platforms should correct the algorithms, which allow hateful communities to cross-pollinate and grow. And finally, moderation systems should be improved and harmonized to ensure that moderators are accurately and equally implementing the policies and community standards across the board. This is something that we did not see happen, for instance, in May with the recent conflict between Hamas and Israel. And we actually had to have a conversation with Facebook, for instance, solely on the double standards that were at play with what content was removed and what content was not. Three final quick prescriptions related to the online space, and this is directly to Congress. So the first is reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to hold tech companies liable if their algorithms promote harmful content. This is very important, and this is going to be bipartisan. Right now, there's Republicans have put forward recommended legislation on this. Democrats have as well. There's not a bipartisan effort. Well, there is one that we need to actually grow around. So this is something we're going to be seeing in the months ahead. The second is designating transnational white supremacist groups as terrorist organizations, which will mandate social media companies to remove their content and severely limit white supremacists' ability to recruit online. And the last is focusing on non-mainstream platforms. This is a very unique role for the U.S. government, which sounds interesting, especially with First Amendment. But today, anti-Semitic radicalization is actually happening mostly on fringe platforms, such as 8kun, which was formerly 8chan. These anti-Semitic and racist websites, many of them are no longer hosted in the United States. They instead have gone to outside hosting domains with less restrictions. So the US government can actually use our power, our leverage to put pressure on countries that are hosting these sites, especially in Southeast Asia. The Philippines is notorious for this, as in former Soviet republics, which again are playing host to these non-mainstream platforms and sites. And the final and third policy prescription that I want to mention, our policy umbrella, if you will, is on data collection, and specifically hate crime data collection, connected to reporting and connected to prosecution. I'm actually going to start with prosecution first. And I want to mention an example, and I'm going to show my screen one last time, of something that happened in May. And those of us who've been following the trends, we know that there was at least an 80% increase of anti-Semitism in the month of May. The ADL actually reported a 115% increase. Carlotta just talked about how the ADL tracks these incidents. So I'll share one last time, bear with me. And here we go. Okay, so we saw that one. Some of you probably know this case. So on Thursday, May 20th, a group of 5 men, and this is pictures of one of the 5, kicked, punched, and pepper sprayed a 29-year-old visibly Jewish man. His name was Joseph Borgen, near Times Square in New York. They yelled, "Dirty Jew," "Filthy Jew," and excuse my language here, "Fuck Israel," "Hamas is going to kill you," "Go back to Israel." 23-year-old Wasim Awadeh was arrested for using a crutch and mace to assault Joseph and was charged with hate crime. He was charged with gang assault, with menacing, and with criminal possession of a weapon. Despite the severity of the charges, Awadeh stated at his arraignment, "If I could do it again, I would do it again. I have no problem doing it again." And he was released on bail. And you can actually see him in the picture on the left celebrating after his release. You see, the state of New York actually favors the perpetrators of anti-Semitic hate crimes because their bail reform laws give judges more discretion in setting bail and other terms of pretrial release. So I'll stop sharing again and finish and come to a conclusion.
You promised a happy ending. That was not a particular.
I know. Here we go.
Okay.
The recommendation here is urgent, actually, reforming the state's bail reform laws. So that is something that we are currently working on. We are prescribing that violent offenses, especially violent hate crimes, should not be included in bail reform laws, and that hate crime perpetrators should not be rehabilitated during incarceration, because what that does is it sends a message that it is okay to commit a hate crime because it won't be taken as seriously. So crimes against Jews, we have to ensure that they're prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and that we have greater consistency across states, because right now it varies state to state. And I think this has come up already in this conference, but we must show how serious our legal system takes anti-Semitism. We also have to close vast gaps in reporting. I'll start with the Jewish community. Of the American Jews who experienced an anti-Semitic incident in the last 5 years, 3 in 4, 76% didn't report it. And one reason why many Jews don't report is because they believe that nothing will change. And this speaks to the resignation in fighting anti-Semitism, unfortunately, or they don't think that it's serious enough, that what they experienced doesn't warrant going to the police, doesn't warrant going to law enforcement. And this speaks to something called the normalization of anti-Semitism. And so, law enforcement really must take anti-Semitism seriously, and we have to encourage community reporting. The other huge issue is lack of reporting from local and state law enforcement to the FBI. So for more than 2 decades, under the 1990 Hate Crime Statistic Act, local, state, tribal, and federal law enforcement agencies only voluntarily submit hate crime data to the FBI. And so as incidents of hate crime have risen, to fully comprehend and formulate effective responses, we need that data. Unfortunately, many cities and many law enforcement agencies don't report their hate crimes. In fact, more than 70 cities in the United States of over 100,000 residents, so we're talking big cities, report 0 incidents, which we know is just not true. So here's a positive. Gerald, this is a big win in the fight against anti-Semitism. We were able to work with many community partners, Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, on the passage of something called the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which links hate crime reporting to Department of Justice training grants and other resources. This act was just signed into law by President Biden, ironically, in May 2021. So the resources aren't into the hands of law enforcement yet, but they will be. And once they are, it's going to help hate crimes bias training, including on anti-Semitism, and establishing hate crimes hotlines. So it's going to be easier for American Jews to report anti-Semitic hate crimes. The one thing I'll mention, and I do want to come to a conclusion here, is the need for better data. And this is also a positive. This is something that we're beginning to get, and we are working right now, even at AJC, on more robust, both quantitative and qualitative studies on the state of anti-Semitism in America. But one thing that I think there is a real need, I think there's a real gap, is we need a larger sample size, especially of US adults. So we've studied, ADL studied, AJC studied, we've studied Americans and their perceptions of anti-Semitism, if they are anti-Semitic, but the sample sizes are very small. I do, one of our prescriptions, if you will, is recommending 5,000, 10,000 people to be interviewed about anti-Semitism, to really get at the why, and to figure out how do we mitigate when anti-Semitism is connected to rising economic uncertainty. What could fix that? We know that anti-Semitism is connected to an increased emphasis on race and national identity. So like how to mitigate that, how to kind of correct even young white men right now in our country who feel left behind or forgotten about. How do we ensure that they don't join movements that whether they be white nationalist movements, but that they can still feel like they belong in a multicultural, pluralistic America, especially with the way that our culture has shifted. The pendulum has swung away from them, and that also has to do with fighting anti-Semitism. So this is extremely important, this better data piece, because I think that's going to inform all of the other areas that we are going toward. So, drawing this to a close, we've talked about government's responsibility, and we have had wins there, and we have ways to go, but we have had wins. We've talked about tech platforms' responsibility. There's been some successes, whether it be denying that Holocaust denial is now no longer on certain platforms, expanding definitions of anti-Semitism, considering where anti-Israel attacks or attacks on Zionists do serve as a proxy for Jews, and then that actually does come down. And then also law enforcement and prosecutors and judges' responsibilities. But I want to end by mentioning one last point, and it's that these responsibilities really must be rooted in socially conscious conscious, and mutually respectful behavior and action. So these three policy categories, while specific to anti-Semitism, are in fact connected to broader democratic values. So this is how we frame everything. It's aligning this core message with the common good, with capturing the public interest. And this is because, and I've shared this many times with practitioners in the field, but we know that people that we try to reach, people we want to raise awareness about, people we want to bring to our side, are not changed by facts and logic, okay? Like, we can't just change people's minds and behaviors by saying, here's a resource about anti-Semitism, believe this, believe that. They actually change their mind when they're placed in new environments, with new people, with relationships with others. And so this is, in the field of anti-Semitism studies, or in the practical area, it's actually not IQ, it's not intelligent quotient that matters, it's EQ, it's emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, and bringing people to experiential learning, whether it be taking them to Israel, whether it be, bringing them to different groups of people, putting them on different teams, and that kind of interaction. And I'm going to close with a quote by Trish Hall, who was the former New York Times editor, and she explains this a little bit further. She says that any kind of persuasion, whether it's done in writing or in person, is essential to establish similarities and shared values. We are persuaded by people we like, not by people we don't. So in just about every situation, we're more likely to accept information, any kind of information, when it comes from someone using language that we understand. So we need non-Jewish voices explaining what anti-Semitism is and why it is a societal problem. So whether it be white evangelical Christian leaders disavowing QAnon, whether it's Black political leaders calling out Farrakhan's anti-Semitism, whether it's Muslim leaders decrying Islamist extremism and anti-Semitism, we need them, because we actually have research, and this is not a good point, Gerald, but it leads to a positive. We need them because we have research that shows that non-Jews do not necessarily listen to Jews to define anti-Semitism, to recognize anti-Semitism and understand it. So that's why this coalition piece is so important. Finally, the last thing that Trish Hall says, if we can put people in an optimistic mood. Studies have shown that people in optimistic moods are actually more likely to hear us. Human bias favors affirmative, it favors positive. So it's not like we say, don't be anti-Semitic. It needs to be framed in an affirmative way. And if we make more positive statements than negative statements when we reach people, they'll actually absorb the information and hold on to it longer. And studies have shown that it's actually not as effective to shame people, to make them feel guilty, to bait them, or to make fun of them in the long term, even though that might feel good in the moment when we're calling out anti-Semitism. So here we are at the end. There's so much happening right now that I'm really excited about. And one of them, and this is the positive I'm going to end with, is working toward a strategy that affects emotion and human relationships to combat anti-Semitism at a mass scale. And this is coming in where there is an innovative and cross-disciplinary and even non-Jewish approach, where we're bringing together American leaders outside of the Jewish world, outside of even the anti-Semitism field, whether it be experts in crisis management, risk assessment, social psychologists, so people who aren't doing anything that we're doing, and bringing them to the table to gather how they're fixing problems in their fields, helping us understand how we can apply it to our field. And I really do think that this coalition of American leaders against anti-Semitism is the next frontier. So thank you.